Throughout history, God has raised up leaders to guide his people through impossible circumstances. Kings have ruled with wisdom, prophets have spoken with power, and warriors have conquered with courage. But among all who ever walked the earth, one man stands apart, a man who knew God in a way no other human being has experienced before or since. His name was Moses. The baby who should have died became the prince who walked away from a throne. The fugitive shepherd who hid in the desert became the deliverer who humbled the great old empire on earth. The man who claimed he couldn't speak became the voice through which God gave his eternal law to all mankind. This is the story of how a Hebrew slave child, rescued from death in a river, would one day stand between towering walls of water and lead millions to freedom. How a humble shepherd would climb a mountain, wrapped in fire and smoke to receive words written by the very finger of God. How an ordinary man would be transformed by encounters with the divine until his own face shone with heaven's light. Come walk with us through the remarkable life of Moses, from the bulrushes of the Nile to the heights of Mount Sinai. Discover how God shapes those he calls, prepares those he sends, and remains faithful to those who trust him through every trial. Egypt had become a prison for God's people. The descendants of Jacob, who came as 70 people during a famine, had multiplied into a mighty nation over several generations, but this blessing became their curse. A new Pharaoh rose to power, who didn't know Joseph or remember how a Hebrew had once saved Egypt from starvation. When he looked at the growing Hebrew population, he saw only a threat to his kingdom. In Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, we read what happened over the generations. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generations died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied, greatly increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. What had started as 70 people had become hundreds of thousands, and this terrified the Egyptian ruler. Then everything changed. A new Pharaoh came to power who didn't know Joseph and didn't remember how a Hebrew had saved Egypt from destruction. When he looked at the growing Hebrew population, he didn't see people who had contributed to Egypt's survival. He saw a potential threat, as Exodus 1 verse 10 records his fear. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. This Pharaoh's paranoia would lead to one of the cruelest campaigns of oppression in human history. Picture the scene as conditions deteriorated for the Hebrew people. Egyptian taskmasters walking among Hebrew workers with whips ready to strike anyone who moved too slowly. Hebrew men bending under impossible loads of clay and straw, their hands bleeding from making bricks hour after hour under the burning sun. Women carrying heavy burdens while pregnant. Children too young to work properly being forced to haul supplies. The Egyptians had a clear strategy, as Exodus 1 verse 14 describes. They made their lives bitter with harsh labor in brick and mortar, and with all kinds of work in the fields. In all their harsh labor, the Egyptians worked them ruthlessly. But something unexpected happened. The harder the Egyptians oppressed the Hebrews, the more they multiplied. This terrified Pharaoh even more, so he decided to attack the source of the problem directly. He called the Hebrew midwives to his palace and gave them a secret order, as Exodus 1 verse 16 records his horrifying command. When you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives were supposed to murder male babies quietly during birth, making it look like natural complications. But these women feared God more than they feared Pharaoh. They refused to murder innocent children, and when Pharaoh realized his secret plan had failed, his rage exploded into an even more terrible decree. As Exodus 1 verse 22 records, then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. The sacred river that gave Egypt life would become a graveyard for Hebrew children. Into this world of absolute terror, a baby was born to a Levite woman. The moment she looked at her newborn son, she knew he was special. As Exodus chapter 2 verse 2 tells us, she saw that he was a fine child, and she hid him for 3 months. The Hebrew word suggests something beyond ordinary beauty, a sense that this child was marked by God for a special purpose. For 3 desperate months, this mother lived in constant fear. Every cry her baby made could mean discovery and death. She muffled his sounds, kept him hidden during the day when soldiers patrolled Hebrew neighborhoods looking for male infants, and prayed that neighbors wouldn't betray them for favor with Egyptian authorities. Can you imagine the terror of those months, never knowing if the next knock on the door would be soldiers coming to tear your baby from your arms and throw him into the river? But babies grow, and their cries get louder. Hiding became impossible. Then this mother did something that takes our breath away. Instead of waiting for soldiers to find her son, she would trust him to the very river Pharaoh had chosen as his tomb. Working with trembling hands, she wove reeds into a basket and carefully sealed it with tar and pitch to make it waterproof, creating a tiny ark. As Exodus 2 verse 3 records her desperate act of faith, when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Her daughter Miriam positioned herself at a distance to watch what would happen to her baby brother. As the sun rose over the Nile, Pharaoh's daughter came to the river for her morning bath. Egyptian royalty often bathed during the cool morning hours before the desert heat became unbearable. Picture the scene: the princess walking with her attendants, choosing a spot where the water flowed gently past thick reeds along the shore. As they prepared for bathing, one of the servants noticed something unusual among the reeds. A basket, clearly handmade and carefully sealed. But what was it doing here, and why was it moving slightly? When they retrieved it and opened the lid, they found a crying baby boy inside. The princess knew immediately what she was looking at. As Exodus 2 verse 6 tells us, she opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. "This is one of the Hebrew babies," she said. This was one of the male infants her father had ordered thrown into the Nile to die. She should have obeyed her father's decree, but instead, compassion filled her heart. Here was innocence personified, a child who needed protection rather than execution. At that critical moment, young Miriam made a move that required incredible courage. A Hebrew girl approaching Egyptian royalty, uninvited, could be killed for such boldness. But Miriam risked everything for her brother, walking up to the most powerful people she had ever seen. Her approach was brilliant in its simplicity, as Exodus 2 verse 7 records. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?" The princess would need someone to feed this infant, and Miriam had the perfect solution. When the princess agreed, Miriam ran home with news her mother could hardly believe. The desperate act of faith had worked beyond imagination. Then came the most stunning development of all. As Exodus 2 verse 9 records what the princess said when the mother arrived, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." The Hebrew woman would raise her own son, love him openly, teach him about his people and their God, and receive Egyptian gold for doing so. God had turned Pharaoh's cruel law into the very instrument of Moses' salvation. The mother who placed her baby in the river of death was now being paid by Pharaoh's own household to raise him. This wasn't luck or coincidence. This was divine providence at work in the most ironic way imaginable. The same Pharaoh who decreed death for Hebrew boys would unknowingly pay for one to be raised in his own palace. The same river meant for drowning would become the path to rescue. The mother's act of desperate faith became the means by which God preserved the deliverer he had chosen before the boy was even born. That baby boy grew up with two worlds inside him. He would receive the finest education Egypt could offer, trained to lead armies and govern provinces. But he would never forget those crucial early years when his mother taught him who he really was. A Hebrew, one of God's chosen people, with a destiny greater than any Egyptian crown could provide. The prince in Pharaoh's palace was being prepared for a mission that would shake the most powerful empire on earth. When Moses entered Pharaoh's palace permanently after being weaned, his mother had already planted seeds of truth that would never be uprooted. Those precious early years had given her time to tell him everything she could about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, about God's promises to their descendants, and about his true Hebrew identity. As Exodus chapter 2, verse 10 records, "When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" The name came from Egyptian words, meaning to draw out, unknowingly prophesying his future role as the one who would draw an entire nation out of slavery. The palace was overwhelming for a young boy who had known only a simple Hebrew home. Gold covered the walls, precious stones decorated every surface, servants attended to every need. But Pharaoh's daughter welcomed him warmly and ensured he received the finest education available anywhere in the world. Moses was trained as Egyptian. Princes were trained, prepared to rule provinces, lead armies, and manage massive construction projects. He studied mathematics and geometry, the sciences Egyptians had mastered for building their monuments. He learned astronomy, the movements of stars that guided navigation and marked seasons. He became fluent in hieroglyphic writing, the complex language of power and administration. Military training was rigorous and comprehensive. Moses learned strategy and tactics, how to position armies and anticipate enemy movements. He mastered sword fighting and archery, the weapons of Egyptian warfare. He studied how Egyptian forces operated with chariots, infantry, and naval units. The royal court also provided leadership training that few in the ancient world could match. Moses observed how Pharaoh governed Egypt, dealt with foreign ambassadors, and managed the massive bureaucracy that kept the nation functioning. He learned to speak with authority, to make decisions that affected thousands, and to project the confidence expected of rulers. Egyptian religion and philosophy were also part of his education. Temple schools taught him about the beliefs that shaped Egyptian culture, their gods and goddesses, their understanding of the afterlife, and Pharaoh's claimed divine status. This knowledge would prove invaluable when he later confronted the entire Egyptian religious system with demonstrations of God's superior power. As Acts chapter 7 verse 22 summarizes his development, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He became a respected figure in court, possibly even leading military campaigns. Some ancient traditions suggest he was a successful general. Everything pointed toward a brilliant future in Egyptian leadership, but Moses never forgot who he really was. His mother's teaching had done its work too well. The truth about his Hebrew identity remained alive in his heart, creating a tension that grew stronger with each passing year. He saw his people suffering while he enjoyed privilege. Every day, he watched Hebrew slaves laboring under brutal conditions while he dined on royal delicacies. Every night, he slept on fine linen while his people collapsed from exhaustion on hard ground. The contrast haunted him, and the internal conflict became unbearable. As he approached his 40th year, Moses made a decision that would change everything. He could no longer observe from a distance. He would leave the comfort of the palace and see for himself what was really happening to his people. This wasn't a casual visit or official inspection. This was a man wrestling with his conscience, trying to understand where he truly belonged in a world divided between oppressor and oppressed. What he witnessed shattered any illusions he might have had about Egyptian treatment of Hebrew slaves. Picture the work sites Moses visited, Hebrew men stumbling under impossible loads, their backs scarred from countless beatings. Women working in blazing sun without adequate water, their bodies thin from insufficient food. Children carrying supplies when they should have been playing, their eyes hollow with despair that no child should know. The Hebrews weren't just laborers performing difficult work. They were people being systematically broken by a cruel system designed to destroy both bodies and spirits. Egyptian taskmasters walked among them with whips and clubs, ready to strike anyone who moved too slowly. They showed no mercy for age or weakness. Old men were beaten for not keeping up with younger workers. Pregnant women were forced to carry heavy loads. The sick received no time to recover, only more work and more punishment. Moses felt emotions he had never experienced with such intensity. Rage burned in his heart at the injustice he was witnessing. Shame filled him for all the years he had enjoyed palace comfort while this happened. Guilt overwhelmed him for benefiting from the very system that was destroying his people. His Egyptian education and his Hebrew heritage collided in violent internal conflict. Then Moses witnessed something that ignited an unquenchable fire in his soul. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster savagely beating a Hebrew worker with shocking brutality. This wasn't discipline or correction. This was torture performed for pleasure. The Hebrew was defenseless, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, completely unable to fight back or escape. The beating would continue until the man was either dead or permanently crippled, as Acts chapter 7 verses 23 and 24 describes what happened. When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. 40 years of accumulated tension exploded into action. Moses looked around quickly, his heart pounding with righteous anger mixed with calculation. The beating was occurring in a remote area where slaves dug clay for bricks, away from main construction sites where other supervisors might see. No Egyptian officials were visible nearby. The Hebrew workers were focused on their own survival, desperately trying to avoid drawing attention to themselves. This appeared to be his chance to act without immediate consequences. His calculation was swift but thorough. Moses had military training and physical power. The taskmaster was completely focused on his victim, unaware that anyone might challenge his authority over a Hebrew slave. Egyptian overseers expected absolute power and would never imagine someone fighting back, especially not an Egyptian prince defending a worthless Hebrew. Moses decided in an instant, and all his rage, guilt, and shame channeled into that decision. He struck with the full force of his training and fury. The Egyptian never had a chance to defend himself. The silence afterward was deafening, as Exodus chapter 2, verse 12 records his actions. Looking this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. For the first time in Egyptian history, an oppressor lay dead at Hebrew hands because someone had valued Hebrew life enough to defend it with violence. Justice had been served, though through means that would have devastating consequences. Moses felt a mixture of satisfaction that he had stopped the torture and horror at what he had done. He had never killed before, but in that moment he felt no regret for ending the life of a man who was murdering his people slowly, one beating at a time. Now came the practical problem of what to do with the body. If discovered, investigations would begin immediately, and Moses knew Egyptian justice was swift and brutal. His identity as Pharaoh's adopted grandson might not protect him if the king learned he had killed an Egyptian to save a Hebrew slave. Working frantically, Moses dug in the sandy soil, constantly watching for approaching people. The same desert sand that covered Egypt would become a grave for this man whose violence had finally been answered with violence. He covered everything carefully, scattering sand to make it look natural, and convinced himself his secret was safe. The remote location, the absence of witnesses, and the fear that would keep Hebrew workers silent all favored his escape from consequences. But Moses had completely misjudged the situation. The next day, when he returned to the work areas and found two Hebrew men fighting violently, he decided to intervene as a peacemaker. His royal training had taught him diplomatic skills and conflict resolution. His sense of justice demanded stopping unnecessary violence wherever he found it. But the man's response hit Moses like a physical blow. As Exodus chapter 2 verses 13 and 14 record the devastating exchange. Moses went out the next day and he saw two Hebrews fighting. He asked the one in the wrong, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" The man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known. The secret was out. Someone had seen everything." His approach to the taskmaster, the violent confrontation, the hasty burial in the sand. Worse, knowledge was spreading among the Hebrew workers. If this man knew about the killing, how many others had heard? Even worse was the man's attitude. Instead of gratitude for defending their people, he showed hostility and suspicion. Instead of seeing Moses as a protector, he questioned his authority. And motives. The rejection cut deeply. Most terrifying was what this meant for his future. How long before word reached Egyptian ears? Pharaoh's fears proved correct, faster than Moses imagined. News reached the palace with the speed that gossip travels in royal circles, perhaps from a Hebrew informant trading information for better treatment, or from Egyptian workers who heard rumors and investigated. As Exodus chapter 2 verse 15 tells us, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. The prince who had grown up in luxury now ran for his life through harsh wilderness with nothing but what he wore. Behind him lay 40 years of education, position, and privilege. Ahead lay an unknown desert and uncertain future. Possibly death from thirst, starvation, or wild animals. But each desperate step away from Egypt was also a step toward the place where God truly wanted him to be, and toward the man God was preparing him to become. After days of brutal travel through the wilderness, Moses finally reached the borders of Midian. The journey had been devastating beyond anything he had experienced in his palace life. The man who had dined on royal delicacies now searched desperately for anything edible. His feet, accustomed to fine palace sandals, had blistered and bled on rocky terrain. The blazing desert sun burned his skin during the day, while cold nights left him shivering without adequate clothing or shelter. Water was the constant, desperate need. In the palace, Moses had enjoyed cool drinks whenever he wanted them. Now he had to find rare oases, springs, or wells, always aware that other travelers might fight him for access. Dehydration was a constant threat, and every day without adequate water brought him closer to death. In the distance, Moses saw the first sign of civilization since fleeing Egypt, a well surrounded by stone walls. Wells were the heart of any desert community, gathering places where locals drew water, shared news, and conducted daily business. They were also places where strangers might find help if they proved themselves trustworthy. As Moses drew closer, exhausted and desperate for water, he witnessed a scene that immediately reminded him why he had fled Egypt in the first place. 7 young women had arrived with their father's flock, ready to draw water for the thirsty animals. But they were being harassed and driven away by rough local shepherds who wanted to use the well first for their own flocks. The scene was all too familiar. The strong oppressing the weak, bullies using force to take what didn't belong to them. These shepherds probably thought they could easily intimidate young women and steal the water they needed, forcing the girls to wait until later when the well might run dry. It was the same injustice Moses had witnessed in Egypt, just on a smaller scale. But the shepherds had badly misjudged their situation. They had no idea that a former Egyptian prince was watching their behavior with growing anger, and that Moses had lost his palace, but not his sense of justice or his willingness to defend the helpless. Moses didn't hesitate or try negotiating with the bullies. His training had taught him that men like this only understood strength, and his recent experiences had stripped away any diplomatic inclinations he might have had. As Exodus chapter 2 verse 17 describes, "Some shepherds came along and drove them away, but Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock." The confrontation was swift and decisive. Moses was strong, confident, and skilled in combat techniques these local shepherds had never encountered. His Egyptian court military training served him well against men who were used to facing only frightened young women. The bullying shepherds quickly realized they had picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than they had anticipated. Moses not only drove off the harassing shepherds, but also took on the hard physical labor of drawing water for all the women's animals. This was back-breaking work under the desert sun, requiring considerable strength and endurance. Each bucket had to be pulled from the deep well, using rope and muscle, then poured into stone troughs for the sheep and goats to drink. It was the kind of work that usually took several people working together for an extended time. When the women returned home much earlier than usual, their father immediately noticed something different. Daily well trips typically took much longer, especially when local shepherds caused problems. As Exodus chapter 2 verses 18 and 19 record the conversation. When the girls returned to Reuel, their father, he asked them, "Why have you returned so early today?" They answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Their father's name was Reuel, also called Jethro in other passages. He was a priest in Midian, a man of wisdom and honor who understood the significance of what had happened. A stranger had shown extraordinary kindness to his daughters, defending them from harassment and helping with difficult work. Such generosity couldn't go unrewarded. Jethro's response revealed his character and the values he had taught his daughters. As Exodus 2 verse 20 records, "And where is he? Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." In desert culture, hospitality to strangers was both sacred duty and practical necessity. You never knew when you might be the stranger needing help in harsh conditions. When Moses accepted the invitation and joined Jethro's family for a meal, the priest was impressed by what he saw. Here was a man of obvious education and refinement, yet willing to work with his hands and defend the helpless. His story of fleeing Egypt for defending Hebrew slaves only increased Jethro's respect. The meeting between Moses and Jethro began a relationship that would profoundly shape both their lives. Jethro was so impressed that he made an extraordinary offer. As Exodus 2 verse 21 tells us, Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. The fugitive prince had found not just temporary refuge, but a new family, a new home, and a completely new identity. Moses settled into a life utterly different from everything he had known before. The man who once wore royal robes now dressed in simple shepherd's clothing. The prince who had commanded servants now tended sheep and goats under the desert sun. His days began before dawn as he led Jethro's flocks to find pasture and water in the harsh landscape. The work was demanding but peaceful in ways the palace had never been. Moses learned to read the desert like a book, discovering where to find water during dry seasons, which plants were safe for animals to eat, and how to protect the flock from wild beasts and sudden storms. His hands, once soft from palace luxury, became calloused from handling ropes and staffs. His feet grew tough from walking rocky terrain for hours every day. Every day brought new lessons in patience that would prove essential for his future calling. Sheep moved slowly and often wandered away from the group, requiring constant vigilance. Moses learned to gently guide them back rather than force them, discovering that leadership in the wilderness meant serving the needs of those under his care. He had to make sure each animal had enough food and water before he could rest himself. The solitude gave Moses extensive time to think about his past and wonder about his future. Far from Egyptian politics and Hebrew suffering, he found a different kind of wisdom. The desert taught him humility in ways the palace never could. He was just one man in a vast wilderness, completely dependent on God's provision for survival. The silence taught him to listen carefully to small sounds that might warn of danger or lead to water sources. Years passed quietly in this new life. Moses married Zipporah, and they had children together. He became fully integrated into Jethro's family, learning from his father-in-law's wisdom and experience. Jethro was a priest who knew God, and their conversations deepened Moses' understanding of divine nature and ways. The angry young man who had killed an Egyptian slowly transformed into a patient, thoughtful shepherd. Moses grew to love the desert, despite its harshness. He learned every trail, every watering hole, every seasonal change in the landscape. The wilderness that had once seemed like punishment became his teacher, showing him lessons about leadership, patience, and dependence on God that would prove absolutely essential when he later led hundreds of thousands of people through these same desert regions. The Egyptian prince was truly dead now, buried in the sand along with his royal ambitions. Moses had become someone entirely new, humble, patient, and dependent on God rather than his own strength or abilities. He probably thought his days of leadership and significance were over forever, that he would spend the rest of his life quietly tending sheep in an obscure desert, unknown and forgotten by history. Little did he know that God had been watching every step of his journey, that every lesson learned in these 40 years of silence was preparation for the greatest assignment any man had ever received. The shepherd who had learned to guide sheep through the wilderness was being prepared to guide God's people to freedom. As the 40th year of his exile approached, Moses had no idea that his real life's work was about to begin. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was sufficient. God had taken a proud Egyptian prince and made him a humble shepherd. Now he was ready to take that humble shepherd and make him the greatest liberator in human history. One ordinary morning, Moses set out with Jethro's flock, as he had done thousands of times before. At 80 years old, he had been a shepherd for 4 decades, longer than he had lived as an Egyptian prince. His routine was so established that he could almost do it without thinking. The sheep knew him and trusted his leadership, following his voice and the sound of his staff. He was leading the animals toward Mount Horeb, also called Mount Sinai in other passages, a place he knew well from his years of shepherding. The mountain was a good area for grazing, with scattered vegetation that could sustain the flock. As Moses guided the sheep along familiar paths, he was probably thinking about practical matters: where to find the best grass, how long to stay in each area, when to move toward water sources. But as they approached the mountain, something caught his attention that made him stop in his tracks. In the distance, he saw what appeared to be a bush on fire. This wasn't particularly unusual in the desert, where dry vegetation often caught fire from lightning strikes or extreme heat. What was unusual, however, was that this bush seemed to be burning continuously without being destroyed by the flames. Moses watched carefully, expecting the fire to die down as the bush was consumed. But the flames kept burning with the same intensity, and the bush remained completely intact. The leaves weren't shriveling, the branches weren't turning to ash, and the fire showed no signs of spreading to surrounding vegetation. It was as if the flames were burning without actually consuming anything. His curiosity was aroused strongly. In 40 years of desert life, Moses had seen many strange things. Mirages that fooled the eyes, unusual weather patterns, rare wildlife appearing in unexpected places. But he had never seen anything remotely like this burning bush that refused to be consumed, as Exodus chapter 3 verse 3 records his thoughts. Moses thought, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." He secured his flock in a safe area where they could graze peacefully. Sheep were easily frightened by unexpected sights or sounds, so he made sure they were comfortable before investigating further. Taking his shepherd's staff, he began walking toward the mysterious bush, his mind racing with possible explanations for what he was seeing. As he got closer, the phenomenon became even more remarkable. The flames were real, dancing and flickering just like normal fire. But the bush itself showed absolutely no signs of damage whatsoever. Every leaf remained green and healthy. Every branch stayed strong and intact. The fire seemed to exist independently of the bush it appeared to be consuming. Moses approached slowly, driven by wonder and caution in equal measure. He had no idea he was about to have an encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. The simple shepherd was walking toward a meeting with the Almighty God of the universe. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the flames. This wasn't the crackling sound of fire or the whisper of wind through leaves. This was a clear, unmistakable voice speaking directly to him with authority that shook him to his core. As Exodus 3 verse 4 records this stunning moment, "When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, 'Moses, Moses.' And Moses said, 'Here I am.'" The voice knew his name. After 40 years of anonymity in the desert, someone was calling him by name with intimate knowledge of who he was. Moses responded immediately, showing the same readiness to serve that had characterized his life as a shepherd, though he had no idea he was speaking to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Then came words that changed everything and made clear this was no ordinary experience. As Exodus 3 verse 5 records the command that stopped Moses in his tracks. "Do not come any closer," God said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses was standing on sacred soil in the very presence of the Almighty. The command was clear and urgent, carrying weight that couldn't be ignored or questioned. Moses immediately bent down and removed his sandals, his hands probably trembling as he realized he was experiencing something far beyond normal human experience. The rocky ground beneath his bare feet was holy because God himself was present there. The burning bush wasn't just a strange natural phenomenon or curious miracle. It was a meeting place between heaven and earth, between the eternal God and a mortal man. Moses probably prostrated himself before the bush, overwhelmed by the awareness that he was in the presence of divine holiness. The voice that spoke from the flames carried absolute authority and power that made his soul tremble. This wasn't a dream or vision that he might question later. This was reality, more real than anything Moses had ever experienced. The fire continued burning without consuming the bush, serving as a visible sign of God's presence, powerful yet controlled, destructive in potential, yet preserving in reality. Fire had always been associated with the divine throughout human history. It provided light in darkness, warmth in cold, and power to transform everything it touched. But this fire was different from anything Moses had seen. It burned without destroying, gave light without casting threatening shadows, radiated presence without causing fear. Then the voice continued, and Moses learned he was in the presence of the God his ancestors had worshipped, as Exodus 3 verse 6 records this revelation. Then he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham." the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. Moses was overwhelmed with holy fear. This wasn't the terror of facing an enemy, but the awe of a finite being encountering infinite majesty. He covered his face with his hands, understanding instinctively that no mortal could look directly upon divine glory and live. The God who had made covenants with his forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, was now speaking to him personally, directly, with purpose that would soon be revealed. God began explaining why he had appeared to Moses at this specific time and place. He had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt and heard their desperate cries for help and deliverance. The time had come for their rescue from bondage, and Moses would be the instrument of their liberation. But Moses needed to know exactly who was sending him on this impossible mission. When Moses asked about God's identity, seeking a name he could give to the Israelites, he received an answer unlike anything he had ever heard, words that would echo through all of human history. As Exodus chapter 3 verses 13 and 14 record this extraordinary conversation. Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you.' And they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." The name was revolutionary in its simplicity and profound beyond measure in its meaning. "I am who I am" declared God's eternal, self-existent nature. He wasn't dependent on anything or anyone else for his existence. He simply was, is, and always would be, without beginning or end. This wasn't just a name in the ordinary sense. It was a revelation of divine character that set this God apart from every other deity worshipped in the ancient world. Other gods were associated with specific places connected to particular peoples, or identified with natural forces like sun, moon, or storms. But the God speaking to Moses transcended all such limitations completely. He existed independently of creation, time, and circumstance. His being wasn't derived from anything else. He was the source of all existence itself. God continued the revelation by connecting this eternal name to his historical relationship with Moses' people, as Exodus 3 verse 15 records. God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.'" The eternal I Am was also the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He wasn't a distant, uninvolved deity, but the God who had made promises to Moses' ancestors and was now acting to fulfill them with power and precision. His eternal nature guaranteed that his promises were absolutely reliable, that what he said he would certainly do. Moses now understood exactly who was commissioning him for the mission ahead. Not a tribal god limited by geography or a natural force bound by creation's laws, but the self-existent creator of the universe. The God who needed nothing but chose to involve himself in human affairs out of love and faithfulness. The eternal being who had bound himself by covenant to care for Abraham's descendants and was now ready to demonstrate his power by liberating them from the most powerful empire on earth. Can you imagine what must have been going through Moses' mind? Here was the God of his ancestors, the God his mother had taught him about in those precious early years, now speaking to him directly and calling him to an impossible task. The shepherd, who thought his life of significance was over, was learning that his greatest work was just beginning. After revealing his identity as the eternal I Am, God gave Moses a mission that seemed absolutely impossible. The Lord had seen the misery of his people in Egypt and heard their cries for deliverance from brutal slavery. Now he was ready to act, and Moses would be his chosen instrument for this incredible work. As Exodus 3 verses 7 and 8 record God's declaration, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The assignment was breathtaking in its scope. Moses wasn't being asked to help a few individuals escape slavery quietly. He was being commissioned to liberate an entire nation from the most powerful empire on earth. The Israelites numbered in the hundreds of thousands, possibly over 2 million people, and they had been enslaved for generations. How could one man accomplish such a massive task? God's command was direct and uncompromising, as Exodus 3 verse 10 records. "So now, go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses was to return to the very place he had fled from 40 years earlier, face the king who wanted him dead, and demand the release of Hebrew slaves who provided free labor for Egypt's ambitious building projects. Moses and his brother Aaron returned to Egypt after 4 decades. The land looked the same, but felt foreign to Moses now. They began by seeking out the Hebrew elders, the leaders who maintained some authority, even under Egyptian oppression. These men needed to be convinced before Moses could approach Pharaoh, because they represented the voice of the people. The elders gathered skeptically to hear what these 2 brothers had to say. Here was Moses, whom some older men might have remembered as the Egyptian prince who had fled after killing a taskmaster. Now he stood before them, claiming that God had appeared to him and commissioned him to lead them out of slavery. It was a remarkable story, but they needed proof of divine authority. As Exodus 4 verses 30 and 31 record what happened. "And Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped." The miraculous signs God had given Moses convinced the elders that divine power was truly behind this mission. His staff became a serpent before their eyes, just as God had demonstrated at the burning bush. Moses' hand became leprous and was instantly healed. These supernatural displays proved beyond doubt that God was with them. But more importantly, the message itself filled the elders with hope they hadn't felt in generations. God had seen their suffering. He had heard their cries for help. He was ready to deliver them from Egyptian bondage after 400 years of slavery. The promise made to Abraham was about to be fulfilled. They would be free, and they would inherit the land God had sworn to give their ancestors. Armed with the support of the Hebrew elders and the power of God's miraculous signs, Moses and Aaron prepared for their first meeting with Pharaoh. This was the moment Moses had dreaded since leaving the burning bush. He was returning to the palace where he had once lived as a prince, now as a fugitive with a death sentence, demanding the impossible. The brothers approached the royal court with the authority of heaven backing their mission. They weren't coming as beggars or humble petitioners pleading for mercy. They came as ambassadors of the Almighty God, delivering a divine decree that demanded obedience. Their message was direct and uncompromising in its clarity. As Exodus 5 verse 1 records their bold words, "Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, 'This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness.'" This wasn't a request that could be negotiated or modified. It was a command from the God of Israel demanding the release of his people. Pharaoh's response revealed his arrogance and contempt for the God of Israel immediately. As Exodus 5 verse 2 records his dismissive reply, Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." The king of Egypt considered himself divine, and wasn't about to take orders from a foreign deity he didn't recognize. To him, this was absurd. Why would he release millions of workers who built his cities and monuments? The labor force that created Egypt's grandeur would not be given up because of some religious request from Hebrew slaves. Moses and Aaron tried again, explaining that the God of the Hebrews had met with them and commanded this time of worship in the wilderness. But Pharaoh wasn't interested in religious explanations or spiritual obligations. He saw their request as a direct threat to his labor force and a challenge to his absolute authority. Instead of granting any concession, Pharaoh became angry at what he perceived as Moses and Aaron's interference with his slaves. He accused them of disrupting the work and making the people lazy with ideas about worship and freedom. His response was swift, calculated, and deliberately cruel. Pharaoh called for his slave drivers and foremen immediately. As Exodus 5 verses 6 through 8 record his commands. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, "Let us go and sacrifice to our God." This was a devastating blow to the already suffering Hebrew slaves. Straw was essential for making strong bricks because it prevented the clay from cracking when it dried in the sun. Now the Israelites would have to find their own straw while maintaining the same impossible production quotas they had struggled to meet when materials were provided. Their already unbearable workload had just become even worse, and it was a direct result of Moses and Aaron's intervention on their behalf. The Israelite foremen were beaten mercilessly when the workers couldn't meet their brick quotas without adequate materials and time. As Exodus 5 verse 14 records, and Israelite overseers appointed by Pharaoh's slave drivers were beaten and were asked, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday, or today as before?" The people's suffering increased dramatically because of the first confrontation with Pharaoh, and many blamed Moses for making their situation worse rather than better. But God wasn't finished with Pharaoh. The king had rejected the Lord's authority and increased his cruelty toward God's people. Now he would witness supernatural power that would force him to acknowledge the God of Israel, even if he refused to submit willingly. God began a systematic assault on Egypt that would humble the mighty nation and demonstrate his supreme power over every aspect of Egyptian life. The plagues weren't random disasters sent in anger. They were carefully targeted judgments against Egyptian gods and the systems that oppressed God's people, each one revealing that the Lord controlled what the Egyptians worshipped. The first plague struck at the heart of Egyptian civilization, as Exodus 7 verses 17 and 18 record God's warning through Moses. This is what the Lord says, "By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water." The sacred Nile, worshipped as a source of life and prosperity, became undrinkable blood throughout Egypt. Fish died by the millions. The water stank horribly. Egyptians couldn't drink from their most precious resource. The second plague brought frogs in overwhelming numbers. They came up from the Nile and invaded everything: palaces, bedrooms, beds, ovens, kneading troughs. Egypt was literally covered with frogs everywhere people looked or stepped. The third plague brought gnats that covered both people and animals. This time, something significant happened. The Egyptian magicians tried to duplicate the miracle with their secret arts but couldn't, as Exodus 8 verses 18 and 19 record. But when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen. The fourth plague sent massive swarms of flies throughout Egypt, but God protected the land of Goshen where the Israelites lived. This demonstrated clearly that the Lord could distinguish between his people and their oppressors, that these weren't natural disasters, but targeted judgments. The fifth plague killed Egyptian livestock while protecting Hebrew animals completely. The sixth plague brought painful boils on people and animals throughout Egypt. The seventh plague sent devastating hail mixed with fire that destroyed crops and killed anyone caught outside. Each plague grew more severe, showing God's escalating judgment against a nation that refused to release his people. The eighth plague brought locusts in numbers never seen before or since. As Exodus 10 verses 14 and 15 describe, they invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. Nothing green remained on tree or plant in all the land of Egypt. The ninth plague brought darkness so thick it could be felt, covering Egypt for 3 full days while the Israelites had light in their homes. Can you imagine the frustration Moses must have felt? Plague after plague devastated Egypt. Promise after promise from Pharaoh was broken. The same cycle repeated 9 times. Disaster struck. Pharaoh begged for relief and promised freedom. Moses prayed, and the plague ended. Then Pharaoh's heart hardened again, and he refused to let Israel go. Each plague targeted Egyptian gods and demonstrated that the Lord controlled everything they worshipped. The Nile they revered, the fertility they depended on, the sun they adored, life itself. Throughout this devastating display of divine power, Pharaoh displayed stubborn resistance that revealed the depths of human pride and rebellion against God. 9 plagues had systematically destroyed Egypt's economy, agriculture, health, and confidence. But the 10th would be different from all the others. It wouldn't attack Egypt's resources or comfort. It would touch every Egyptian home in a way that was personal, irreversible, and absolutely devastating. Before unleashing the final and most devastating plague upon Egypt, God established a ceremony that would forever mark the night of Israel's deliverance. This wasn't just about escaping slavery. It was about becoming God's covenant people through an act of faith and obedience that would be remembered for all generations to come. God gave Moses detailed instructions for a ritual that would protect the Hebrew families from the coming judgment while distinguishing them clearly from the Egyptians who had oppressed them so cruelly. As Exodus 12 verses 3 and 4 record the command, "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are." The lamb had to meet specific requirements that made it precious and significant. As Exodus 12 verse 5 explains, the animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats. This wasn't just any animal selected randomly. It had to be perfect, young and healthy, representing the best each family could offer to God. For 4 days, each family would keep their chosen lamb, caring for it daily and inevitably growing attached to it. Children would play with it, families would feed it, and bonds would form. Then came the moment of sacrifice, which made the cost of redemption real and personal. As Exodus 12 verses 6 and 7 record, "Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the door frames of the houses where they eat the lambs. The blood on the door frames would serve as a visible sign of faith and obedience to God's commands. Every Hebrew family had to trust that this simple act would protect them from the coming judgment. They couldn't rely on their ethnicity or good works or past faithfulness. Only the blood of the lamb applied to their doorway could save them from death that night. The meal itself was carefully prescribed with symbolic meaning in every detail. As Exodus 12 verses 8 and 9 record, that same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roast it over a fire, with the head, legs, and internal organs. The bitter herbs reminded them of slavery's bitterness. The unleavened bread spoke of leaving in haste without time for dough to rise. The people were to eat dressed and ready for immediate departure. As Exodus 12 verse 11 explains, this is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. They had to be prepared to leave Egypt at a moment's notice when God's judgment fell and Pharaoh's resistance finally broke. God explained the significance of this ceremony in words that would echo through all of history. As Exodus 12 verses 12 and 13 record, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn of both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt." The night of the Passover became the most important night in Israel's history. As darkness fell over Egypt, Hebrew families gathered in their homes with lamb's blood, marking their doorframes exactly as God had commanded. They ate the prescribed meal in haste, dressed and ready to leave, trusting that the blood would protect them from the angel of death passing through the land. Outside their blood-marked homes, Egyptian firstborn had no such protection from the coming judgment. At midnight, the Lord struck with devastating precision throughout all of Egypt, as Exodus 12 verses 29 and 30 record the terrible fulfillment of God's warning. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. The judgment was complete, inescapable, and absolutely impartial. From the royal palace to the humblest prison cell, every Egyptian family lost their firstborn son that night. Pharaoh's own heir died along with the heirs of his officials and common people alike. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was no death or mourning at all. Every house marked with lamb's blood was passed over by the destroyer, exactly as God had promised. The Lord had kept his word to protect those who trusted in the blood of the sacrificial lamb. The difference between life and death that night was the simple act of faith and obedience, applying the blood to the doorframe and trusting God's promise of protection. Pharaoh's resistance finally crumbled completely in the face of personal, devastating loss. The king, who had repeatedly hardened his heart, now broke under the unbearable weight of his son's death. As Exodus 12 verses 31 and 32 record his urgent message to Moses during the night. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds, as you have said, and go. And also bless me." The Egyptian people, who had watched their nation suffer through 9 devastating plagues, now desperately urged the Israelites to leave immediately. As Exodus 12 verse 33 records, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country, for otherwise, they said, we will all die. They feared that continued presence of the Hebrews would bring even more divine judgment upon them all. In their rush to see the Israelites gone, The Egyptians gave them whatever they asked for. As Exodus 12 verses 35 and 36 record this remarkable development. The Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold, and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Hebrew slaves who had entered Egypt with nothing were now leaving with the wealth of their former oppressors. This wasn't theft, but divine justice, payment for centuries of unpaid labor and brutal treatment. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would leave their place of slavery with great possessions, and that ancient promise was being fulfilled precisely. The Israelites left Egypt that very night after 430 years in the land. As Exodus 12 verse 41 records, at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Their liberation wasn't gradual or partial. It was immediate and complete, exactly as God had promised Moses at the burning bush. But the celebration of freedom was short-lived. After the initial shock of losing his firstborn son wore off, Pharaoh began to regret his decision to release the Hebrew slaves. The reality of losing millions of workers hit him hard, and his stubborn pride reasserted itself one final time, as Exodus 14 verses 5 and 6 record Pharaoh's change of heart. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. The most powerful military force in the ancient world was now pursuing the escaped slaves with deadly intent. Pharaoh assembled 600 of his best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt. These weren't just vehicles for transportation. They were weapons of war, each carrying trained soldiers armed with spears, bows, and the finest weapons Egypt could produce. Meanwhile, the Israelites had been traveling toward the wilderness, but found themselves trapped at the Red Sea. God had led them to this specific location, even though it seemed like a dead end with no escape route. As Exodus 14 verses 10 through 12 record their terror when they saw the approaching army. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." Can you imagine the terror of being literally trapped with no escape? Behind them was the most powerful army on earth, intent on recapturing or killing them. Ahead was an uncrossable sea, deep and wide. On both sides were impossible mountains and cliffs. They felt completely abandoned and betrayed by God and Moses. The people's faith evaporated instantly in the face of what appeared to be certain disaster, and they forgot all the miraculous plagues that had secured their freedom just days before. Moses responded with words that would echo through history as one of the greatest declarations of faith ever spoken. As Exodus 14 verses 13 and 14 record his powerful declaration, Moses answered the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still." God would handle this impossible situation that seemed to have no solution. The Lord gave Moses specific instructions for the greatest miracle yet performed in human history. As Exodus 14 verse 16 records the stunning command, "Raise your staff and stretch out your hand over the sea to divide the water so that the Israelites can go through the sea on dry ground." When Moses stretched out his staff over the water, God sent a powerful east wind that blew all night long, dividing the sea and creating a path of dry ground between towering walls of water on both sides. As Exodus 14 verses 21 and 22 record this impossible miracle. Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left. The crossing took considerable time as over 2 million Israelites with their livestock and possessions moved through the divided sea on the dry path God had created. The Egyptian army followed in pursuit, their chariots racing onto the seabed that should have been impossible to cross. But God confused their forces and jammed their chariot wheels in the muddy ground, causing panic and chaos. When the last Israelite reached the far shore safely, Moses stretched out his hand again over the waters. As Exodus 14 verses 27 and 28 record the complete destruction of Egypt's army. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not one of them survived. The greatest military power in the ancient world was destroyed in moments. The sea that had provided escape for Israel became a grave for their oppressors. God had fought for his people and delivered them completely and finally from Egyptian bondage. The Israelites would never see those Egyptians again, exactly as Moses had declared. Their liberation was absolute and irreversible. The excitement of freedom quickly turned to anxiety as the Israelites faced the harsh reality of desert survival. Over 2 million people with their livestock were now wandering in a wilderness that could barely support a few thousand nomads under normal conditions. Food supplies from Egypt were running low rapidly, and water sources were scarce and unpredictable. The people began to realize that freedom came with its own severe challenges and difficulties they hadn't anticipated. Just 3 days into their journey, the Israelites faced their first crisis in the wilderness. They found water at a place called Marah, but it was too bitter to drink safely. The people grumbled against Moses, and he cried out to the Lord for help. God showed him a piece of wood, and when Moses threw it into the water, it became sweet and drinkable. The food crisis came shortly after. As their Egyptian supplies ran out completely, the people began to panic about starvation. As Exodus 16 verses 2 and 3 record their complaint, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Their memories of slavery were already becoming selective. They remembered the food, but forgot the whips, the brutality, the murdered babies. God's response was gracious despite their lack of faith and constant complaining. As Exodus 16 verse 4 records his promise, "Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day." The next morning, the ground was covered with a substance the Israelites had never seen before. It appeared with the dew, white like coriander seed, and tasted like wafers made with honey. They called it manna, which means, "What is it?" God also provided meat when the people craved it, sending quail in such abundance that they covered the camp. When they needed water, God made it flow from solid rock. As Exodus 17 verse 6 records, "Strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink." These miracles taught Israel to depend on divine provision day by day, trusting God for their daily needs rather than storing up provisions in fear. 3 months after leaving Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, the same place where Moses had encountered the burning bush. This wasn't just a rest stop on their journey, but their destination for receiving the laws that would govern them as God's covenant people. The mountain would become the birthplace of their national identity and the place where they would formally enter into covenant relationship with the Lord. God called Moses up the mountain to receive instructions for the people. As Exodus 19 verses 5 and 6 record the Lord's powerful message, "Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." The people agreed to this covenant relationship, committing themselves to obey everything the Lord commanded. Then God began preparing the mountain for his dramatic appearance in a way that would demonstrate his awesome power and holiness. As Exodus 19 verses 16 through 18 describe the terrifying scene. On the morning of the third day, there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain, and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Then Moses led the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The people were absolutely terrified by this display of divine power and majesty. They had never experienced anything remotely like this, and many feared they would die just from being in God's presence. From this terrifying display of fire, smoke, thunder, and earthquake, God spoke the 10 Commandments directly to all the people. His voice thundered from the mountain, laying down fundamental laws that would govern their relationship with him and with each other. These weren't merely suggestions or guidelines for better living. They were absolute commands from the sovereign creator of the universe. The people were so terrified by God's voice speaking from the fire that they begged Moses to act as intermediary. As Exodus 20, verse 19, records their plea, they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but do not have God speak to us, or we will die." Moses then went up the mountain to receive the complete law directly from God. As Exodus 24 verse 12 records God's summons, the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." During 40 days and 40 nights on the mountain, God gave Moses detailed instructions for every aspect of Israel's life as his people. The law covered worship practices, civil government, social relationships, dietary regulations, festival celebrations, and moral conduct. God wrote the 10 Commandments on stone tablets with his own finger, demonstrating their permanent nature and divine origin. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving God's law, the people below grew restless and impatient. 40 days seemed like an eternity, and they began to worry that Moses might never return from the mountain. Their faith in both Moses and the invisible God who had delivered them from Egypt started to waver dangerously. The people approached Aaron with a request that revealed how quickly they had forgotten all of God's mighty acts on their behalf. As Exodus 32 verse 1 records their shocking demand. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, "Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses, who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him." Aaron should have refused absolutely and reminded them of everything God had done. But instead, he gave in to their pressure with tragic consequences. As Exodus 32 verse 4 records his fateful decision, he took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, "These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." The golden calf represented everything God had forbidden in the first 2 commandments. Making idols and worshipping created things instead of the Creator. They were attributing their deliverance from Egypt to a golden statue instead of to the Lord, who had demonstrated his power through 10 devastating plagues. Meanwhile, on the mountain, God informed Moses of what was happening below. As Exodus 32, verses 7 and 8 record God's anger. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them, and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. They have bowed down to it and sacrificed to it." When Moses descended the mountain carrying the stone tablets and saw the golden calf with wild celebration around it, his anger exploded with righteous fury, as Exodus 32 verse 19 records his response. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. The broken tablets symbolized the broken covenant between God and Israel. They had violated the covenant before Moses could even deliver its terms to them. Moses immediately positioned himself between the people and divine judgment, pleading passionately for mercy. As Exodus 32 verses 31 and 32 record his powerful intercession. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, "Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses was willing to sacrifice his own eternal destiny to save the people from God's wrath. This level of intercession revealed how deeply he had come to love the people despite their constant rebellion and complaining. God heard Moses' prayer and showed mercy, though consequences still came for the sin. Moses' role as intercessor continued throughout their wilderness journey, standing before God and pleading for mercy whenever the people sinned or faced crisis. The daily administration of justice among so many people quickly overwhelmed Moses completely. As Exodus 18 verse 13 describes the exhausting problem, the next day, Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening. Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, observed this unsustainable situation and offered wise counsel. As Exodus 18 verses 21 and 22 record his practical plan. "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves." Moses implemented this judicial system, which allowed him to focus on the most important cases while ensuring justice was available to everyone. Throughout these wilderness years, Moses developed a relationship with God, unlike any other human being in history. While the people remained at a distance from divine presence, terrified of God's holiness, Moses was invited into intimate fellowship with the Almighty that transformed him physically and spiritually. The Bible describes Moses' unique relationship with God in extraordinary terms. As Numbers 12 verses 7 and 8 record God's own testimony about his servant. "But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord." Moses received direct, clear communication from God in a way that set him apart from all other prophets. This face-to-face relationship was so intense that it physically affected Moses in visible ways. As Exodus 34 verses 29 and 30 record this remarkable phenomenon. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him. The glory of God had left a visible mark on Moses' face that frightened people. He had to wear a veil when speaking to the people, because his face shone so brightly after spending time in God's presence. What does it mean to speak with God face to face when Scripture clearly teaches that no one can see God's face and live? This paradox reveals something profound about Moses' unique relationship with the Lord. He experienced an intimacy and directness in communication that no other person had known. God granted Moses' request to see his glory in a way that revealed divine character without destroying the mortal man who made the request. As Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7 record this stunning self-revelation. And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin. As the 40 years of wilderness wandering neared their end, Moses knew his time as leader was almost over. God had told him he would not enter the promised land because of an incident where Moses had struck the rock in anger instead of speaking to it as commanded, taking credit for the miracle instead of honoring God before the people. Moses gathered all Israel for his final address, which is recorded in the book of Deuteronomy. This was a comprehensive review of God's faithfulness and a renewal of the covenant for the new generation that would enter Canaan. Moses reminded the people of their entire journey and restated the law for settled life in the Promised Land rather than nomadic existence. The great theme running through his final speeches was love for God expressed through faithful obedience. As Deuteronomy 6 verses 4 and 5 record his famous declaration, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength." Moses warned them against forgetting God when they finally enjoyed prosperity in the land, and he blessed each tribe individually, prophesying about their future. The time came for Moses to depart from the people he had led for 40 challenging years. At 120 years old, he was still physically strong and mentally sharp, but God had determined his work was finished. The Lord called Moses to climb Mount Nebo, which overlooked the Promised Land from across the Jordan River. From the mountain summit, God showed Moses the entire land his people would inherit. As Deuteronomy 34, verses 1 through 4, record this final vision. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo from the plains of Moab to the top of Pisgah, across from Jericho. There the Lord showed him the whole land. Then the Lord said to him, "This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, 'I will give it to your descendants.' I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it." Moses died there on Mount Nebo, alone with God, just as he had lived much of his life, in intimate communion with the Lord. As Deuteronomy 34 verses 5 through 7 record his peaceful passing. And Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. God himself buried his faithful servant in a secret location, perhaps to prevent the Israelites from turning his tomb into a shrine for idolatrous worship. The Bible's final assessment of Moses emphasizes his absolutely unique relationship with God and his unmatched role in Israel's history. As Deuteronomy 34 verses 10 through 12 conclude, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." Moses' story is one of the most remarkable in all of human history. He was preserved from death as an infant, raised in Pharaoh's palace, forced to flee as a fugitive, transformed in the desert as a shepherd, Called by God from a burning bush, empowered to confront the most powerful empire on earth, used to deliver an entire nation from slavery, entrusted with God's law written by divine finger and granted intimacy with God that no other person has experienced. His legacy extends far beyond the events of his lifetime. The law he delivered shaped Israel's identity for thousands of years. The Passover he instituted is still celebrated today. The example of his faithful intercession still challenges believers to stand in the gap for others. Moses' life reminds us that God often prepares his servants through long seasons of obscurity before their public ministry begins. The 40 years in Pharaoh's palace gave him education and leadership skills. The 40 years in Midian's wilderness gave him humility and desert knowledge. The 40 years leading Israel taught him an intercession and patience. Each season was essential preparation for what followed. His story also reveals that God can use anyone willing to say yes to his calling, regardless of their past failures or present inadequacies. The man who killed an Egyptian and fled in fear became the deliverer of millions. The man who claimed he couldn't speak well became the mouthpiece of God. The fugitive shepherd became the greatest leader in Israel's history. Most importantly, Moses' intimate relationship with God shows us what is possible when we pursue knowing the Lord above everything else. His face shone with God's glory because he spent time in divine presence. He spoke with confidence because he heard God's voice clearly. He interceded powerfully because he knew God's heart. The same God who called Moses from a burning bush still calls people today to impossible tasks that require divine power. The God who provided manna in the wilderness still supplies our daily needs. The Lord who spoke face to face with his servant still invites us into intimate relationship through prayer and his word. Moses died and was buried, but the God of Moses lives forever, still looking for people who will respond when he calls, still transforming ordinary people into extraordinary instruments of his purposes. If this journey through Moses' life has touched your heart or deepened your faith, we would be honored if you would subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss future stories from Scripture. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that God specializes in using imperfect people for his perfect plans. Leave a comment below and let us know which moment from Moses' story resonated most deeply with you. Thank you for walking with us through the incredible life of Moses, the man who knew God face to face. May his story inspire you to draw closer to the Lord, to trust him in impossible circumstances, and to say yes when he calls your name. Until we meet again in God's Word, may you know his presence, experience his faithfulness, and walk in his purpose for your life.